Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the last NCGE webinar of the 22-23 school year. I appreciate you being here with us tonight. Tonight is also the last of our four-part series that we've been partnering with the Institute of Middle East Studies at GW, George Washington University. And so again, as many of you know, the National Council of Geographic Education believes that geography education is the bridge to a better understanding and appreciation of all subject matters. And through our four webinars that we've had with the Institute of Middle East Studies, we've seen that multiple subjects that we've been able to bring into our geography curriculum. So tonight we have the pleasure of having Graham Pitts with us. He is a professor at the University of Mississippi, and he's going to talk about the history of food and famine. So I'm going to let him introduce himself. He is going to ask you guys to unmute and introduce yourselves here at the beginning, just to warn you if you want to. So just unmute for now. We can turn cameras on a little later. So I'm going to turn it over to Graham and he can take it from there. So thank you so much, Graham, for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Julie. I appreciate you and Teresa Hale organizing this workshop. Thank you to NCGE and George Washington as well. So like Julie said, I'm an assistant professor at the University of Mississippi. I'm a historian. I work in the Middle East, and I've, in the last few years, come to food studies. So first I'll share my screen, give a little introduction, and then I'll have you all introduce yourselves. So the title of today's talk is Teaching Food and Famine. If you have any questions now or later, please do not hesitate to contact me by email.
You have it in speaker mode, Graham.
I have it in speaker mode. Well, thank you for that tip. How's that?
There we go.
Cool, better. Thank you, Julie. So what's brought me here is I had the opportunity to co-edit a book with a collaborator, Annie Gall, and an editor, Vicky Velasic, about the history and the contemporary realities surrounding Levantine cuisine. By the Levant, I mean Palestine, Jordan, Israel, Syria, and Lebanon. And this is the first book, strangely, in my opinion, on one of the world's great cuisines. And I'll talk about, through the course of the presentation, how I came to work on this project. And among the materials that you've received from Julie is a PDF copy of this. And so today is learning outcomes. I'll describe the learning outcomes in three questions. First, what is the history of food and famine in the Middle East? And I'll talk about that through my own research, and which is about Lebanon during the First World War. There was a famine in Lebanon during the First World War, and I'll explain why that happened. What makes Levantine cuisine? I'll talk about what makes Levantine cuisine different from other cuisines in the Middle East, indeed other cuisines in the Eastern Mediterranean. And I'll talk about what I think food studies can offer your classroom on the Middle East and beyond. But first, I would ask you to briefly introduce yourselves and suggest how this session might be helpful for your teaching. So I'll start. I'm originally from Greensboro, North Carolina. I always wanted to travel abroad and come back to the South and teach about the Middle East. And I was lucky to land a job at the University of Mississippi, where I have the opportunity to teach a lot of students who are preparing to go teach high school. So engaging with you all with this group really helps me understand how best to orient my curriculum for them. So I will call on people if that's okay. And I will unshare my screen, and let's go around, starting with Dr. Monk, Lily Monk.
Hi, I'm Lily Monk. I teach at GW. Can you hear me? And
yes, very well.
I teach Latin American geography, but I will be teaching a course on people, land, and food in the spring. So this presentation is right up my alley, and I'm very eager to listen to what you have to say. And I very much like the Levantine cuisine. Tried it in Jordan and Israel, so I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Well, likewise, thank you, Lily. Okay, now let's go to Celeste.
Hi there, Graham. My name is Celeste Reynolds, and I teach AP Human Geography in Massachusetts. And I actually just returned from Qatar about a month ago, and it was actually only supposed to be a year, but it ended up being 3 years of working with the QFI Foundation. We learned a lot about the Middle East, and it was wonderful. And I've just discovered a new region that I love, and the cuisine was wonderful. And I just wanted to hear what you had to say. So thank
Right.
you.
Thank you. And let's go to Kelly Siobhan.
Hi, I'm Kelly. I teach currently Global 1 and 2 in New York, but next year I'm going to be teaching AP Human Geography for the first time. So this is kind of like a starter intro for me.
Great. Welcome, Kelly. And now to Rachel Barker. Yes, ma'am.
Hi there. I teach AP Human Geography, and I was just looking for, just how I can understand my own subject more, and then looking for like some cool or fun activities to do after the AP test, because like we don't get out of school till June 23rd, so I'm looking for just some enrichment for after the test.
Right. Hope we can offer that. Tracy introduced herself in the chat. Tracy, do you want to introduce yourself live and on air too?
Can you hear me? My computer's doing some strange things.
We can hear you very well.
All right. I'm Tracy Law. I'm from Cincinnati. I teach high school, including AP Human Geo and Honors Global Issues. And the latter is a project-based class. And so I always am looking for things that I can turn into class activities or projects. And this sounded like it would be something that could really draw them in.
Great. Thank you, Tracy. And now on to Christy McGuire.
Hi, how are we tonight, everybody?
Very well.
Good.
I'm Christy McGuire from Omaha, Nebraska, and I teach AP Human Geography and a Human Diversity class, multicultural ed class, mostly to freshmen. And so I'm tuning in just for general knowledge for me and see how I can infuse in any information into not only AP Human, but maybe also my Human Diversity class.
Great. Thank you, Christy. And now, Reagan, please.
I introduced myself in the chat. My name is Rhonda, and I'm a retired community college geography professor. I'm just joining for personal benefit.
Great. Thank you, Rhonda. And now on to Linda.
Linda may
Linda, we
not have
can't
a
hear you.
mic available.
Yeah,
Linda
we
may
can't-
not
we
have a
don't-
mic
can't.
available.
Anyway.
Yeah.
Welcome, Linda. Happy to have you. And now on to Francis. Francis
Hi.
Coffee.
I'm Frances Coffey. I teach AP Human Geography in Northern Virginia. Many of my students have a Middle Eastern background, so I'm looking to connect more with them and, of course, integrate it into the curriculum. It's good seeing some friendly faces.
Great. Thank you, Francis. And Teresa Hale. Teresa, I know you're coordinating, but I'll give you the opportunity to introduce yourself.
Hi, but I'm Teresa. I work at the Institute for Middle East Studies at GW, and I'm attending I'm equally as interested in the subject, but I also organized the event. So I like to see how they go. And it's great to hear what everyone is interested in. So we have a lot of resources on our website too, that I'll direct you to in the chat. So hopefully that can provide you some with additional resources to, project-based, ideas and things like that. That was great to hear. So thanks to everyone for attending.
Thank you, Teresa. And last but not least is Xiaofeng Kang.
All right. Can you hear me or see me?
Both.
Yep.
Very well.
Good. Thank you. So my name is Xiaofeng. I am from Beijing, China. I taught IBDP geography before, and currently I'm teaching grade 6 geography and high school AP Human Geography. Personally, I'm very interested about the relationship between food and religion in the Middle East.
Thank you, Xiaofeng. And hopefully I'll have some good content on that particular topic in this presentation. So
thank you.
I always try to have participants speak as early as possible in a session because I read in the literature on teaching and learning that everybody feels more engaged, feels a sense of belonging the earlier they speak. So I do that as a matter of course. And now I'm going to give you the shortest possible version of my research talk, and then we're going to talk about some potential activities for your classroom. Excuse me while I share my screen one more time. How's that, everybody? Are you seeing the presenter's display again? Are you seeing?
Yes.
Are you seeing my slides? You're seeing the
Slides.
presenter. Okay, switch. Oh, you were seeing
Yeah,
slides.
Slides,
Oh,
yeah.
look what I did. Okay, great. Okay, all systems go. Thanks, everybody. So, Famine in the Making of Lebanon. This is my dissertation work. This is the book that I'm writing now, which is about the environment and capitalism in Lebanon. And I call it environmental history is social history. So not the environment for just the sake of nature, but this is a way to tell a story about relationship to the rest of nature. So that's what I mean by the environment. So first of all, I ask a very empirical question. Why did a famine kill 1 in 3 Lebanese between 1915 and 1918? In per capita terms, this was the highest loss of life anywhere in the world in a national polity. Serbia may be after this, but this is just an enormous story of which hasn't been fully told. But the predominant interpretation of the famine, as I'll discuss, is that Lebanon became the victim of the Committee of Union and Progress, the CUP, the Ottoman ruling clique, who took revenge on them for being allies of France and Britain, or for being Christians, or for being Arabs. This is explained in different ways. But basically, fundamentally, this is a story, a nationalist story about Lebanon suffering at the hands of outsiders. We're going to talk about what the famine reveals about the history of Lebanon, the Middle East, and the globe. And specifically for our purposes, I'll talk about what this means for global food systems. Very simply, during the modern period, we have much more than enough food for everybody. It's just not, especially during war times, made available to particular populations. So that's why starvation happens. That's why famines happen. They're a political problem. They're not any kind of natural disaster when we have a famine. It's a political and social dysfunction that causes it. So after the war was over, the Ottoman Empire, of course, stops existing in 1923, but in the Arab provinces, the Ottoman Empire was sovereign from the 16th century to the early 20th century. And so the First World War sort of ends that 400 years of Ottoman rule. France and Britain colonize those Arab regions of the empire afterwards. And the story that's told is that the Lebanese faced the same fate as the Armenians. So Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha, and Jamal, that they were like the 3 leaders of the Ottoman Empire during the war. And this book, written by a priest in 1922, basically accuses them of genocide. This is repeated in a resolution on the floor of the US House very recently. So I want to convince you that this has been a very persuasive interpretation of the event. And if you look at the second there, the campaign of genocide against Armenians and Maronites, I think that the first part of this is correct. There's an enormous scholarly consensus that, in fact, the Ottoman Empire did plan the annihilation of its Armenian population during the First World War. I just don't think that explains the famine that happened in Lebanite. And Maronites are Lebanese Catholic Christians, if you don't know that reference. But so the majority of the Ottoman Special District of Mount Lebanon were Maronite Christians, and they suffered the most, but other populations, including Druze, a heterodox Muslim sect, and other Christian populations suffered alongside them. After the war, what had been in Lebanon had been an autonomous special district of the Ottoman Empire beforehand. After the war, Lebanon is expanded, its territory is increased by 3 times, and it becomes ultimately a republic. And that happens under the auspices of French colonialism. Lebanon becomes independent during the Second World War, during 1943, after a brief interval of French colonization. So the work in the archives that I did in manuscripts like this, that I found in monasteries, tended to contradict the story that has been told about the famine and how he's writing here in 1918, so he's not being censored as the Ottoman army is leaving Lebanon. He anticipates how this will be interpreted, and he says the Turks did not commit a fraction of evil that, and he names some local strongmen in a town below where his monastery is. He says they were given grain to distribute, and they sold it. And they were the reason for the neglect of many, the murder of many, and the death by starvation of thousands, because they sold wheat destined for the poor. So he's giving an alternative interpretation here that I think is persuasive. It makes the famine about class conflict internal to Lebanese society, and not primarily the result of an external plan for this to happen. And the Ottoman archive, we see the same interpretation. Here is the governor of Damascus who's refusing to send grain to Beirut because he says they're stealing it. This is a clique of merchants putting private over public interests. It's important to note that these people weren't merchants as much as they were Ottoman politicians. And the Ottoman government doesn't, like the central government in Istanbul, doesn't have a lot of cash. And they don't have a lot of administrative wherewithal to make sure that provisioning is happening. And so turn it over to some local elites. These people are from Greek Orthodox backgrounds, from Sunni Muslim backgrounds, from Maronite backgrounds. So this isn't a sectarian question, although the famine has oftentimes been interpreted in sectarian terms. All of these factors were affecting the entire region, but death rates in Lebanon are 1 in 3, and in the surrounding Syrian region and the rest of the Levant are around 10%. So what makes Lebanon special? I argue that it's the predominance of capitalist social relations there. And when you see that through this graph, income in Lebanon was first silk, the silk industry, and I'll talk about this a little more later, boomed after the 1840s. Once you have steamships connecting the port at Beirut with Marseille, and that raw silk is processed in Lyon. But there's a bust in the silk market that happens already in the 19th century, in the early 1870s. And by the 1880s, the Lebanese start to migrate to the United States. So in 1914, the biggest source of income for the Lebanese, remittances from abroad. This remains the case today. I argue that this is a very sort of shaky, vulnerable, fragile ecological strategy to rely on flows of income from abroad. That has certainly proven the case for the Lebanese. Indeed, one-dimensional reliance on an export crop was also the source of vulnerability for the Lebanese. So the core of my project is to show this tension between what is a very prosperous society, a very prosperous peasantry, especially a prosperous rural society, a growing Lebanese middle class that's traveling to the United States, that's sending money back. Many people are working in factories. Many people are doing well in dry goods in the United States too. So I don't want to make it seem like everybody who migrates gets rich. Of course, that isn't the case. But in comparative terms, when you have people coming from Lebanon to the United States, they have more money in their pocket than your average Polish immigrant does, than your average Greek immigrant. So it's not that capitalism had impoverished the society per se, but it had created vulnerabilities that become truly evident during the war itself. It was an importer of grain. So Lebanese peasants were not self-sufficient. They relied on the cash economy. And again, this is what distinguishes them from surrounding populations. And this is why they die at a higher rate once these global flows of capital, humans, goods are cut off during the war. So it's not, the fact of exchange isn't new. We don't need to look further than a source like the Bible, of course, that talks about timber in Lebanon, wine in Lebanon. Lots of Islamic sources talk about apples in Lebanon that are eaten as far away as Baghdad. Because it rains a lot in the mountain, that ecological zone, where it rains as much as it does in London, is very close to arid areas that are good for growing some grain or grazing. There had been an incentive for people in Lebanon to exchange tree crops for livestock and grain since throughout the historical period. That intensifies in the 19th century when this one-dimensional reliance on exchange develops. I talked about migration to the Americas. Again, this begins the so-called first wave of Lebanese migration, which is predominantly but not exclusively Christian, begins in 1882. Here's another 1 in 3 number. 1 in 3 inhabitants of Mount Lebanon have gone to the Americas before the First World War. And I've mapped the data in this ledger here. And we've created a database online of these remittance payments that happened during the war. And you can see that migration is not limited to Mount Lebanon, but per capita remittances are much higher there than they are elsewhere. Something sort of throwing off that ratio for the Beirut province, that very large green circle there. Those are American Jewish communities in northern Palestine, in the town of Safad. And so just to give you a sense, sort of a color of like one experience of a family migrating, this family comes to the Saliba family, come to Dothan, Alabama, in the early 20th century, before the First World War. And what I think is so interesting here, and I've highlighted a quote, this is a letter of recommendation written for Mr. Saliba there, who says that he would like to have more men like him come from the old country to identify themselves with us. These people, of course, were on the white side of the color line in Alabama. And I'll show you another picture of this family later to make a point about an evolution that's happening within US society that makes migration as a less viable ecological strategy for the Lebanese. This is the port at Beirut where people embarked from, and that becomes increasingly impossible for lots of reasons. So the barriers to mobility that are on the rise here that I see is contributing to the famine. First of all, is the Ottoman decision to fight in World War I and regain sovereignty that they had lost to France and Britain before the war. So the Ottomans go to war because they're tired of losing land, basically, to Russia, to France, to Britain, and they think tying their horse to Germany's is going to be an escape route. And specifically, they're going to stop losing territory to insurgent Christian nationalisms. So they're scared about an Armenian state in Eastern Anatolia, and they're also scared about a Lebanese state, an independent Christian Lebanese state in the Eastern Mediterranean. So they try to stop this Lebanese sort of free movement in every sense out of the port at Beirut. The Allied blockade, so something that I haven't talked about yet in the presentation is absolutely essential to understanding the famine, is that France, Lebanon's supposed ally, blockades the coast throughout the war and refuses to let food aid in, despite the fact that they're fully apprised of the famine conditions. And I found sort of a smoking gun there where the French government says, the more these people starve, the more they'll greet us as liberators when the war is all over. And then US immigration restrictions are another barrier to mobility that are passed in 1917. And then again in 1924, they create what amounts to an all-white immigration policy to the United States and ends the first wave of massive Levantine immigration to the United States. And so, and I've created a data set here to try to understand why starvation is happening. And as far as I can tell, it's the provinces that are most reliant on the production of silk that fare the worst. So silk's long bust. So I see the famine happens as sort of an anomalous event. It's a war famine. It would not have happened but for the war, but we can also read it as sort of this long commodity cycle and the long bust of the silk economy. And we can also sort of think about this chapter in Lebanon's history as a period of open immigration everywhere in the world, specifically in the United States, which closes as nativism is on the rise in the early 20th century. So this is the same family I showed you earlier. They have a few more kids. The father dies. He's shot in Lebanon, and the instability that happens after the war. And you can see this is the same woman that I showed you earlier. Here she's lightening her skin and straightening her hair. And we know from qualitative evidence, we know anecdotally that life for Lebanese and Syrians in the United States becomes much harder. They face much more racism over time. So I see that as part and parcel as the same sort of global closures. There's part of these global closures that are happening that lead to the First World War and are growing before it as a response to economic instability. I'll say just openly that for me, this is an allegory for the time period that we're living in now. So with regards to that global context, I'll just come back to one quotation here that I find sort of evocative of the suffering that happened during the famine. And I want to look at this intersectionally, and I want to understand sort of the gendered experience of famine. And here's an open letter that a Lebanese writer directs to a French general who's coming to occupy Lebanon after the war. And he says, and I'll read the quotation, "An underage girl who will shock you will meet." He's describing what the general will encounter in Beirut. And he says, "You will encounter an underage girl who will shock you with her air of being a prostitute. If you ask her about her family, that suggestive smile will disappear from her face and be replaced by tears. She will tell you that she comes from this village in Mount Lebanon or that neighborhood in Beirut, and that after her parents mortgaged their home and fields for a morsel of bread, they died of hunger. Then she became prey for the same monopolist murderers of her family that she sees promenading in their rich carriages, and to whom the French and English now extend their hands and whose invitations they accept." So this is another source like the one I started with. It's very clear that the suffering that happens in Lebanon is understood by the people who experienced it to be the product of class conflict. These people who perpetrated the famine on the local level were Ottoman elites, and they become Lebanese elites sort of seamlessly. And you see the suggestion that that's happening here. These people were never subjected to any kind of justice. So I've given sort of a big structural explanation, a global structural explanation of why Lebanon was susceptible to this, but I don't want to let anybody off the hook along the way, like the intense capitalist system that was pretty unique in the Eastern Mediterranean, that was based around Beirut and in Mount Lebanon, also allowed for the commodification of food and this wartime profiteering that was the proximate cause of suffering. So this is the establishment of Greater Lebanon in 1920, and Greater Lebanon is declared here, and there's the French general Gouraud on the steps of the mansion of one of those profiteering families. And so this sort of the suffering of that period all kind of fades into the background. The culpability of local elites, the culpability of France is more or less forgotten. So by way of conclusions, the same sort of inequalities that produced the food crisis then shape the narrative that's told about the famine later. It's because it's those same families end up with control of the state that the story that I'm telling hasn't been told in Lebanon since that time. The predominance of capitalist social relations distinguishes Lebanon from the rest of the rural Ottoman Empire. Allied control over food resources was decisive in World War I. So the weaponization of food caused the famine. And this is a plan hatched by Great Britain some years before the war. They knew they were going to be able to starve Germany they knew they were going to be able to starve the Germans. And ultimately that happened. When German populations begin to starve, they surrender. However, some populations in the Ottoman Empire allied with Germany had been starving for years before that moves the conscience of anybody to intervene and try to fix the problem. It's important to note that Belgians and Polish people get food aid through the blockade, but the Lebanese do not. You can interpret that either because of their race, I think that would be persuasive, or because France plans to colonize Lebanon after the war. And famine did ease the imposition of European colonialism in the Eastern Mediterranean. You have British troops are arriving to Palestine and people are yelling, welcome. People absolutely embrace the French and the British with open arms as they arrive, not because they wanted to be colonized with them, because they had been starving for 3 years. So starvation starts first in Mount Lebanon and then spreads across the region. So this is how I came to food studies. I spent years and years thinking about, reading about, talking about famine and people starving to death, and that ultimately became a bit depressing. So I wanted to put a more human face on the region, and I wanted to do something that was a bit more uplifting for everybody, and including myself. And so when I was at Georgetown Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, I had the opportunity to host a conference and bring people in working on these questions. And I was just so happy with how this volume came out. You have a PDF of it. Let me talk through the table of contents really quickly. So sort of the quintessential Levantine dish for me is kibbeh. So a Lebanese collaborator and I wrote a chapter about kibbeh, is bulgur wheat mixed with meat and onions and spices and baked like a dumpling in lots of different forms that I can't really summarize, but I encourage you to read the chapter. It's not something you find in Ottoman Anatolia. It's not something, you find it now in Egypt, but that's because Levantines brought it there. So here I talk about sort of how the Levantine became Lebanese, and that didn't happen until the 1950s. In the handout that you have, I've recommended some chapters, including chapter 2 here, which is going to introduce your students or you to a region that you might not know, that they might not know, which is the Adana region in sort of the Turkish south, is where the earthquake just happened. So your students may have some kind of plug there, and it talks about how this is a porous zone between what's now Syria and modern Turkey. And there's some really interesting questions of the appropriation of Armenian foodways and kind of the aftermath of the genocide there that I think will be interesting for you and your students. Chapter 5 is one that I recommended, is an awesome introduction to what's happening in Israel and Palestine and what kind of role food plays in that. And so what I love about food as a topic is it sort of can take a contentious issue and let us see it from a totally fresh angle in a way that's not going to be confrontational to students on different sides of an issue, but is going to sort of, bring everybody to the table. Although I think we're careful to argue in the book that the idea that people, like the diffusion of culinary customs can't be assumed to indicate a bettering of intercommunal relations. If anything, the opposite is true. And so in this final part of the book, I recommend embodying Levantine cuisine in East Amman, in Jordan, for your students. It's very accessible. It talks about women's labor in the kitchen. It's just a fabulous piece of anthropology. And then chapter 10 there, Unmaking Levantine Cuisine, is about fast food and sort of this unrooting of what Levantine is in Europe and the United States, that I think would be a fun read for you and your students. And finally, I'll suggest some activities here. And one is to use recipes. You can collect any recipes for your students and talk about what knowledge they assume, what moral lessons do they seek to impart. And the ideology is going to be like a little more intense there, the older the cookbook you find probably. And what sort of home do they envision? What kind of gender relations? So I encourage you to find 3 or 4 recipes, put your students into groups, and just have them talk through how can they cook these recipes? What ingredients would they need? What ingredients wouldn't they have? And so in each section of this book, we have a personal essay and recipe. So you see that's pistachios and pomegranates there in chapter 4, and those will be very, very accessible for your students. When I read these with mine, they liked those the best. So you can use the 3 recipes in this book. Reem Cassis has some recipes from Palestine there, and she includes 3 recipes in hers. So feel free to use those as well. And finally, we have some sort of Egyptian fast food, Levantine fast food recipes that you can use. But in doing the first activity, we always encounter kind of the limits of the knowledge that's transmitted in formal cookbooks. And so that's where oral history can come in. So for the purposes of our discussion, I'll invite everybody back in, and I would ask you to look at the oral history activity that's at the end of that PDF packet that I shared with you. And I think this is such a valuable activity to get students doing their own family history, to find a relative, and ideally this is aimed towards understanding work, labor that's not that's undervalued in capitalism. It's unpaid labor and women's labor, and to understand how culinary traditions change over the time, how labor evolves in the household. And so those questions that I gave you that were developed by my collaborator Annie Gall for her research in Egypt would be a great set of issues to take to like the oldest female relative that they can find. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm ready to answer any questions, and just while talking, if you can flip through those, I think that'll be a nice basis for a discussion for about 10 minutes, 15 minutes, something like that.
Yeah, thank you. That was great. I got a couple ideas to lessons together. So please feel free to turn your cameras on and ask some questions, and let's have some discussion about food. Now, I'm out on the West Coast, so it's getting close to dinner time. So let's hear what we have to say. Yes, Tracy, I will send those right now.
Oh, and I shared a textbook that's just chock full of activities to use that I like by Willa Zinn. And that's the last thing. That's not focused on the Middle East at all. That's global.
Any questions from anybody? Well, Graham, you must have just overwhelmed them with information, or they're deep into reading and looking what they're going to cook for dinner tomorrow night with the recipes in the book.
Yeah, I hope that wasn't too deep in the weeds. But so just to summarize a bit what's in the oral history activity is just about recreating sort of like the spices that were used in the kitchen of your grandmother or mother, who did the cooking, was there domestic help involved? And the funnest thing that I've tried to do in my family is recreate recipes that people didn't write down. Lily, please.
Yes, let me see if I can start my video. Okay, all right. I noticed that one of the recipes mentioned Antep, and you mentioned that it's South Turkey, northern Syria. I presume that that is the area called Gaziantep as well, or may have something to do with that. And I do know that it's an area where there's a lot of pistachios, correct? Or am I totally
No,
off
exactly.
base?
No, you nailed it. That's it.
Yeah,
And that's
okay.
what and that's what the chapter's about. In the late Ottoman period, they call them Sham fıstığı. So they call them like Syrian pistachios.
Right.
But it's confusing because that same word refers to the city of Damascus, but also the whole of the Levant. And then the Turkish in the Turkish Republic, they make them Antep pistachios instead, to sort of distance something that's very central to Turkish cuisine from its Arab and Armenian past, if that makes sense.
That makes
and so
sense.
It's a fascinating example of appropriation in a national context, where something that's created, which is modern Turkish cuisine, the cuisine of the Republic of Turkey, is revealing something and hiding something, right? And so for me, that's been productive and sparking a discussion about appropriation, because when students come to the topic, that's what they're really interested in. And I try to convince them that the crime that was committed was not the appropriation of pistachios into Antep pistachios. it was rather the expulsion of Armenian and Arab populations and genocide. So if that makes sense, I think that's a great allegory for some of the issues that we confront in our own society, if you will, where we can say, maybe white people cooking barbecue isn't really the offensive thing, but it becomes representative for some historical crimes, right? And so I try to focus students' attention towards that, because the diffusion of culinary traditions is a very natural thing for human beings, and something I think that we should encourage.
Yeah, I
But-
remember I had the tremendous luck to visit Gaziantep, obviously before the catastrophe from last year. And I remember that it was very well known for having tons of baklava places where they would sell, with pistachios. And that's why all of a sudden that chapter evoked that visit and the cuisine of that area, which was very interesting.
And so you're one of the few, but not lots of people in the United States know about that. And food is just the best way to get at the fact that this becomes a borderlands.
Yes.
And the food ties these places together, and it's also a vehicle to tell some very tragic history. So I'm excited that you saw that chapter, and it brought you back to Gaziantep, because the food of that region is some of my favorite in the world, like the food that they make in Antakya. And this is a place where people still speak Arabic. Like I don't speak Turkish very well, so I would go and need to speak Arabic to people, and people who identify as Turkish are still native Arabic speakers there. So what a fascinating, interesting, variegated place.
There's, if I can just add one more thing, there's a movie, and I'll try to find out the name of it. And it's about making hummus between the West Bank and in Israel, and kind of like a war, but who makes the best hummus? I think something about burning Tel Aviv or something. I have to, but I would recommend it if I can find the full name of it, because it really shows also, again, the appropriation of whose hummus is it, that crosses boundaries. And as you said, and I liked what you had to say, that food is one great connector between peoples, and in a way honoring the traditions of other peoples. So I'll try to find the name of it.
Is that the musical? There's kind of like a musical. It's like a Romeo and Juliet about two competing hummus restaurants. You may be thinking of something else. I watched that many years ago, but it would be a fun thing to show a clip of to students. I'll track that down and share it with Julie.
Cool.
Hey, Graham, question that a couple of us in the chat are, we're a little intrigued with the recipes in class. So could you give us a little more idea of what a discussion looks like from students when you put a recipe in front of them of not only ingredients they don't know or are familiar with, but how do you guide them through discussion?
So I would focus on like techniques that the recipe assumes that I would find like the oldest cookbook that you have, because there's going to be a lot of ideology there. Like I mentioned about how a woman should organize a proper moral home. I think that'll strike students as it's just a great way to understand gender as something that's changing over time.
Yeah, so more about the instruction, not necessarily the ingredients.
Well, both. I mean, you can take that in so many different directions. This is why I like the discussion of food, but I like to bring in class there. So like a lot of the like Emily Post etiquette, right, which isn't primarily a cookbook, but is like a similar sort of thing that I would include in a stack of sources. She assumes that the family that she's writing to has servants. So also to see like the home that's created is aspirational. Or like the way to organize your time. So like how much, like a recipe might like, and this is especially true of Levantine dishes, like how much time does a recipe assume that you have to cook this dish?
Okay.
So what does that assume about what the people in the house are doing? And who's working and who's not working? And if to uphold a certain set of cultural traditions, you have to spend these long hours a day making these dishes. What does that do to women
I
who
see
have
it
to
now.
work out
Yep.
of that home?
Yep.
Outside the home, and what does that do to women who, especially like in a modern Levantine context, it was sort of upward social mobility to have men only working outside of the home,
Right.
making a wage, if that makes sense. So just race, class, and gender, however, whatever the appropriate way to frame those questions is.
Right. Yeah.
But you,
okay, that makes sense. Absolutely.
and then you can go and I would take, I do take this all the way forward in time and say, how is this working out right now? Like if you young people want to know how to cook something, where do you look? Of course, the answer to that question is TikTok videos, and YouTube. And you want to, so if you start with Emily Post and bring that forward, then they'll be wise to the fact that the TikTok video also has kind of an ideology to it, and especially what kind of homes are being shown in these influencers videos. And so who can have homes like that, have kitchens like that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know what it's like to talk about race, class, and gender with high school students, but I know, so I can't counsel you on exactly like the right approaches or topics.
I don't either. I don't talk about it. No, I'm just kidding. Okay, Tracy Law, you and I have a plan here. We're gonna write a lesson plan.
That sounds good. This made me run into the kitchen and grab my 1931 Joy of Cooking.
Oh,
and Graham, I think this is kind of what you're talking about when you're talking about the assumptions. The foreword talks about things like what every kitchen-minded woman possesses and how that's grown across time. And then this is written in a method so clear a child can follow it. And then the end is all about, I've been so encouraged by a variety of sources, an eloping bride and a man who looked at me fondly to say, if I can finally eat something. And so
wow.
I think that's what you're going for when you're talking about taking some of these and just kind of even delving into forewords or things like that to get at those sorts of assumptions. Precisely.
And when we take a historical text, and that's the cookbook that I grew up with in my house, and students will get that immediately, right? This is for white people. This is for upper middle class people. Fortunately, I think for the generation of students that we're teaching, it's really natural to be kind of struck by how quaint and dated all that is. And so I always hope to give them those. So that all comes alive when we engage with that text. But how can we help them understand the contemporary sources with that same kind of critical lens? So I think that's the arc that we really want them to grab there. But thank you for bringing out your joy of cooking to make that point. That's a cookbook that's close to my heart and is a great cookbook and is really helpful in questions of technique, because they don't assume that you know techniques, right? Like they explain the techniques in the book. 20 years before that, they weren't really doing that. There was a lot more assumptions made about you already kind of. So you get you get more explanation as time goes on.
That's awesome. Some great ideas here. Lily shared the name of the movie she was talking about. For those of you who aren't looking at the chat, it's called Tel Aviv on Fire. It's a competition about who makes the best, I'm going to say hummus, because
that's how you pronounce
on both sides of the border. I have another name for hummus, but I'm not going to say what it is. I'm not a fan of hummus. And then Francis shared a podcast about Russian cookbooks. For those of you who might be interested who are not in the chat, I will make sure that these get in documents when the recording is shared. So any other questions for Graham tonight? Okay, Graham, they can ask me, like, you have your information. You want to put your email in the chat, Graham, for
Sure.
them if they have any questions? Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Again, this is the last for this school year for NCGE. And Graham just put his email in there. So if any of you need to reach out to him, any last words, Graham?
Oh, can I just one thing, because I promised to say a word about religion. Arab Christians have fast days, and so there's always a vegetarian alternative for each dish. This is what made Levantine cuisine very popular in the West in the modern period, as vegetarianism and like health food booms. It's just such a natural fit to have all of those vegetarian options included for liturgical reasons, because Eastern Christians needed to fast. So that was that plug. Anyway, thank you all so much for being here.
Okay, learned another thing new.
I appreciate it.
So thank you everyone for joining us tonight, and I hope you have a great end of the school year and a restful, relaxing summer. And we'll be back online Wednesday nights in August. I believe we're going to start up. So have a great summer, everyone. Thank you for your continued support.